Hey, my name is Nate. Nate Collier. I'm 32 years old, and I repair clocks for a living in a town called Dryden, Vermont, which is about as small as it sounds. The kind of place where the coffee shop has 4 tables and the hardware store closes on Wednesdays for reasons nobody has ever publicly explained. I know how that sounds. Clock repair. It sounds like something a person does in a movie about a widower who has too many cats and not enough plot. But it's a real trade. There are more clocks in the world than most people realize, and a surprising number of them belong to people who are not going to simply throw them away when they stop working. Because the clock belonged to someone who is no longer here, or because the clock is 130 years old and deserves better than a landfill. I work on antique movements, Mantel clocks, wall regulators, bracket clocks, a few pocket watches. I do the occasional wristwatch when it's interesting enough. I have a workshop at the back of the house that smells like machine oil and old wood, and I keep it very quiet in there because some of the work requires listening. That's the thing most people don't know about clocks. You can diagnose a lot of problems by sound before you open the case. A movement that's running fast often has a particular flutter in its escapement. A mainspring that's nearing the end of its tension has a subtle drag in the beat. A pivot that's worn down just slightly will introduce a catch, a fraction of a hesitation that you wouldn't notice unless you were still and paying attention. I've spent 11 years learning how things sound when they're wrong. I can hear a fault in a movement from across the room if the room is quiet enough. My day runs like this. I'm up around 6. I make coffee, sit with it at the kitchen table for 20 minutes without my phone because my brain doesn't work well if I rush it at the start of the day. I go out to the workshop by 7, check what's on the bench from the day before, and work until noon. I eat lunch, usually something from whatever I put together the night before, go back to the workshop until 4 or 5. I clean the bench. I write up whatever I finished. I eat dinner, watch some TV, read a little, and sleep by 10. My social life is the post office, the coffee shop on Thursday mornings, and occasional dinners at my brother Owen's house when he and his wife decide I'm looking too solitary, which is Owen's way of checking on me without saying he's checking on me. It's a quiet life. I know that. I'm not embarrassed by it. The work requires concentration, and concentration requires quiet. And over the years, the quiet outside the workshop and the quiet inside it have become the same kind of quiet, which is fine, which was fine. There was a woman named Greta 4 years ago. We were together for about 18 months. She lived in Burlington. I lived here. And the 60 miles between us felt manageable for the first year, and then started to feel like a measurement of something else. She was warm and energetic and had a large group of friends she saw constantly, and I think she thought the quietness in me was depth at first, and then slowly understood it was just quietness. The last time we talked, she said, "Nate, I don't think you need a person. I think you need a very good clock." She meant it gently, and it landed gently, and I thought about it for a long time afterward, the way you think about something that is mostly accurate and only unfair in one small corner. After Greta, I stopped reaching. Not deliberately. I didn't make a decision about it. I just stopped. The way a clock stops when the mainspring finally runs down. Not broken, just still. That's where I was in November, when my brother Owen called on a Monday afternoon and said he needed a favor. Owen is 4 years older than me, and he builds furniture, custom pieces, mostly tables and chairs and shelving for people who want something that will last longer than they will. He'd been commissioned to build a dining table for a family in Montpelier, a big piece, 6 chairs, and he delivered it in his truck over the weekend and gotten a flat tire on the way back in the dark on Route 2. He'd left the truck at a garage in a town called Calder, which was about 40 minutes from Dryden, and the garage needed 2 days to get a tire in the right size. "I need someone to go pick up the truck Wednesday morning," he said. "Paula's got the kids and can't take a day, and I've got a client coming to the shop." "What garage?" I asked. He gave me the name and address and said the contact was the owner, a woman named Iris who he'd dealt with before and spoke well of. I said I'd take care of it. I cleared my Wednesday, arranged for my neighbor to let me borrow her car so I'd have a way back since I'd be driving Owen's truck home. I got to the garage at 9:15 on a gray Wednesday morning. It was the kind of late November cold that comes in wet, not dry, and the sky was low and uniform and smelled like it was deciding whether to snow. The garage was a 2-bay operation on the main street of Calder, small town, smaller than Dryden. A hand-painted sign that said Calder Auto A&D Tire over the door. I parked and went inside. The bay doors were open, and there was a truck up on the lift in one, and in the other, a woman was crouching next to a sedan with a clipboard, writing something down in the fast, shorthand way of someone who's been doing this long enough that they don't have to look at what they're writing. She stood when she heard me come in. She was about my age, maybe a year or two older, with brown hair pulled back under a gray knit hat that had been pushed up slightly on one side. Her work jacket had Calder on the back. Her hands had the particular clean but not quite of someone who works with grease every day and knows how to minimize it. She looked at me directly in the assessing way that people who run their own shops look at customers, sizing up what they actually need versus what they think they need. "Nate Collier," I said. "I'm here for Owen Collier's truck." "Iris," she said. "Iris Hale." She had a level voice, the kind that doesn't give much away. She looked back at the clipboard and said, "We got the tire on this morning." The rim was fine, which was lucky. The spare had been sitting underinflated for a while, which is less lucky. You can tell your brother to check that. I'll tell him. He should also look at his front left brake pad within the next few months. Not urgent, but it's getting close. She said it without looking up. I'll write it on the invoice. She led me to the office, a small room off the garage floor, organized in a way that was slightly startling given the chaos of most mechanics' offices I'd seen. Invoices in labeled folders, parts bins labeled. A whiteboard with a weekly schedule broken into clear columns. She pulled Owen's invoice, ran through it. I paid. She handed me the keys. We were standing at the bay door looking out at the truck when she said, without particular interest, "What do you do?" "Clock repair," I said. She looked at me. "Huh," she said. "People say that. I'm not saying it as a judgment," she said. "I'm saying it because I have a clock." She paused. In a manner of speaking, I waited. "My grandmother's bracket clock," she said. "It's been stopping. Started about 6 months ago. Runs for a few days. Stops. I wind it. It runs again. I took it to the antique shop in Montpellier, and the man there said it probably just needed cleaning, but he didn't work on movements, and he gave me a name in Burlington that I've been meaning to call for 6 months. Bracket clock. Do you know the maker?" she thought. "There's a name on the face. Erskine. I always assumed it was the maker. Could be the retailer. Can you describe the movement? Do you know if it's spring-driven or weight-driven?" She gave me a look that was not quite a smile. "I run an auto shop. I know what drives a movement." "Spring-driven," I said. "Yes. How old?" "My grandmother got it from her grandmother, so at least 100 years. Maybe more." I thought about it. A clock that runs and stops and runs again, with the same winding regime, it's usually one of 3 things. Dirt in the train, worn pivot, or the mainspring has a set in it and it's losing tension inconsistently. All 3 are fixable. The first 2 are inexpensive. She looked at me. "You're doing a differential diagnosis." Occupational habit, I said. She considered this for a moment. Then she said, I'll get your brother's name in the system in case he needs anything. She went back inside. I stood at the bay door and looked at Owen's truck and thought about a 100-year-old bracket clock stopping and starting, and the way something worn down by years will sometimes run fine until a particular stress on a particular day, and then it simply can't anymore without attention. I drove the truck back to Dryden. That evening, I looked up Erskine and found 3 possible cases: 1 English maker, 1 Scottish retailer, 1 American manufacturer who licensed the name. I don't know why I did that. I wasn't asked to. She emailed 2 weeks later. I had given her my card at the garage. Workshop contact, it was what I had. And she said she'd found a photograph of the clock's movement on my website that looked similar to her grandmother's, and asked if I did pickup or if she needed to bring it to me. I said either was fine. She said she'd bring it the following Saturday because she was closed Saturdays, and it was an hour drive, and she could make a day of it if there was anything worth seeing in Dryden. I told her there was a good used bookstore and a covered bridge that people drove from out of state to photograph. She said that sounded like enough. She arrived at 10 in the morning with the clock wrapped in a moving blanket and a canvas tote bag, and she carried it with the care of someone carrying something that is not primarily an object. I brought her back to the workshop, and she set it on the bench and unwrapped it and stepped back and looked at it with the expression of someone reintroducing 2 people who haven't seen each other in a while. It was a beautiful piece. Dark walnut case, about 14 inches tall, brass finials, a painted enamel dial with blue numerals. I opened the back and looked at the movement. She stood beside me and watched without talking, which I appreciated. English, I said. Late Victorian, probably 1885 to 1895. The name on the dial is the retailer. The movement is a few C chain drive. I looked at the train. There's significant accumulated dirt in the wheel teeth. Probably hasn't been properly cleaned since the 30s, maybe earlier. Can you fix it? Yes, 2 to 3 weeks. I'll clean the movement, check the pivots under magnification, regulate it when it's back together. I looked up at her. It's a good clock. The case is in excellent shape. Someone took care of the outside. My grandmother polished it every Sunday, she said. She said it flatly, as a fact, but the fact had weight in it. The inside just needs the same attention, I said. Cleaning and oil. Things run better when they're not carrying 30 years of accumulated friction. She looked at the clock. Then she said, "That sentence does a lot of work." I looked at her. She was looking at the movement, not at me. But there was something in the corner of her mouth. "The bookstore," I said, "and the bridge." "Did you want to?" "Yes," she said. Before I finished, we walked to the bookstore and she spent 40 minutes in it, which was the right amount of time. She bought 3 paperbacks without hesitation, which told me something about how she made decisions. We walked to the covered bridge and stood on it in the cold and looked at the creek running below, and she said, "How long have you been in Dryden?" "My whole life except college." "And you stayed?" "The work is here," I said. "The workshop was my father's. He repaired clocks, I repaired clocks alongside him, and when he got sick it made sense for me to take it over." She looked at the water. "He's not here anymore." "No, 6 years ago. I'm sorry." "It was a good end," I said, which was true. He was in the workshop the morning of the day he died. He finished a job. He left the bench clean. She was quiet for a moment. Then my father left things in the middle. She said it in the same tone, flat, factual, the grief inside it belonging to a time that has already been processed to the extent it can be processed. Heart attack 3 years ago. He was in the middle of 6 things the way he always was. A pause. I kept the garage because he built it. I worked in it with him from the time I was 12. It felt, I don't know, like finishing what he left unfinished. I said, I understand that. She looked at me, and I think she believed me, which mattered. We had lunch at the coffee shop because it was the only place open. Biscuits and soup. She asked questions about clock movements the way people ask when they're genuinely interested, rather than being polite. Specific questions. Follow-up questions. Questions that revealed she'd been thinking about the mechanism the way she thought about engines. She wanted to understand what drove what. How the energy transferred, what happened when one component failed, and whether the rest of the system compensated or simply stopped. The rest usually compensates for a while, I said. That's the danger. You don't notice the problem because the clock keeps running. Then one day the compensation isn't enough and it stops. She held her coffee cup with both hands and looked at me. That happens with cars too, she said. People ignore the small signs. They think it's fine because it's still moving. She paused. It's fine until it isn't. Same principle, I said. Different machines, she said, with the corner of her mouth again. She drove back to Calder at 2 in the afternoon, and I stood in the driveway and watched her car until it turned off the street. Then I went back into the workshop and looked at the movement of her grandmother's clock under the bench lamp and began. The cleaning took a week. I worked through it methodically, wheel by wheel, pivot by pivot. The way the work always goes. You disassemble, you clean each component, you look at each piece under magnification, you make a note, you reassemble. It is slow and it is quiet, and it is the kind of work that empties the mind of everything except the problem in front of you. Except, I found. Not entirely. I found myself thinking about a 2-bay garage in a small town and a woman with a clipboard who wrote in the shorthand of someone who knows her trade deeply, and the way she'd said her father left things in the middle and she'd stayed to finish them. I found myself thinking about how she'd stood at the bench looking at the open movement, not asking questions, just watching. The way good mechanics watch an unfamiliar system before they start working on it. I cleaned the pivots and found one that needed a slight polish, not worn enough to require replacement, but enough to account for some of the intermittent stopping. I regulated the escapement. I oiled the train. I wound the clock and let it run for 3 days and checked it twice a day for consistency. On the 5th day, it was keeping time to within 8 seconds per day, which for a clock of its age was excellent. On the 7th day, it was at 5 seconds. I let it run through the weekend, and it held. I called her on a Monday. She picked up on the second ring and said, "How bad is it?" "It's good," I said. Pivot needed polishing, movement needed cleaning. It's running 5 seconds a day, which will improve as everything settles. A pause. Then, quietly, "Can it keep doing that?" With cleaning every 5 to 7 years. Yes, it has a lot of years left. The pause this time was different, longer, and I understood it was not about the clock. It was about the 100-year-old thing her grandmother had polished every Sunday and that had started to stop, and the fact that it wasn't stopping anymore. "Thank you," she said, in a voice that was being kept very steady. "Come get it whenever you want," I said. She said she'd come Saturday. She came Saturday, and I brought the clock out to the kitchen table and wound it in front of her, and we sat and watched it run. The tick was clean and even, a quiet, steady count, the sound a movement makes when nothing is working against it. She sat with her hands in her lap and listened to it, and I watched her listen to it, and neither of us said anything for a while. Then she said, "I want to hear more about how it works." She said it the way she'd said yes to the bookstore, before I'd finished the thought, like she'd already decided. So I told her. She asked questions. I answered them. It got dark outside without either of us noticing, and at some point I heated up dinner, leftover soup, bread I'd made on Friday, and she stayed for it. And we ate at the kitchen table with her grandmother's clock ticking on the counter between us. She told me about Calder, about taking over the garage at 27 when her father died, and none of the 3 employees thought she knew what she was doing, and she spent 4 months proving them wrong in the specific, methodical way she proved things wrong, by doing the work. About the customer who'd come in last spring with a car that made a sound she'd never heard before, not in a bad vehicle, in a good one, which was stranger, and she'd had to take it apart to the point where she understood it, before she understood the problem, and the problem turned out to be a modification a previous owner had made to the exhaust that had been working against the engine for 30,000 miles. The car was compensating, she said, the whole time, just burning itself down slowly to deal with the thing that shouldn't have been there. Did you fix it? I asked. Took a week, she said. He cried when I told him how much he'd spent compensating. The bill for the repair was a quarter of what the compensation had cost him over 4 years. I looked at her. Things run better when they're not carrying 30 years of accumulated friction, I said. She looked at me. That corner of her mouth again, and this time it finished into a real smile, brief and unguarded, and it rearranged her entire face for a moment. She drove back to Calder at 9 o'clock. She took the clock wrapped in its moving blanket, and she put it in the passenger seat rather than the back, which seemed right. The kitchen was very quiet after she left. I sat at the table for a while without moving. The place where the clock had been on the counter was just the counter now, and the absence of the sound was the loudest thing in the room. We talked on the phone after that. Not every day, every few days, in the evenings. She'd describe a complicated repair, and I'd describe a complicated movement, and we'd end up somewhere else entirely. Her father, my father, the garage, the workshop, what it meant to take something over and learn it from the inside out rather than the beginning. She told me about a customer who'd come in crying because the estimate from the dealership was more than the car was worth, and she'd found a way to do the same repair for 1/3 of the price by sourcing the part herself. And the woman had hugged her in the parking lot, and she hadn't known what to do with her hands. I told her about a clock I'd worked on for 3 months, a long case piece from the 1740s, English, that had been in a family for 6 generations, and when I'd finished it, and the owner had come to pick it up and heard the bell strike for the first time in 40 years. Neither of us had said anything for a full minute. She said she understood that. I believed her. She was funny in a way I hadn't expected. Dry and precise, the humor arriving in the same flat tone as everything else, so that you had to be paying attention, or you'd miss it. She told me about a customer who'd asked her to just take a look at his truck, and she'd found 47 things wrong, and she'd had to write them in order of urgency, because handing someone a list of 47 things was not useful. She told me he'd sold the truck. I said that was probably the right outcome. She said he'd cried a little, which she'd handled by handing him the estimate she'd written up before he'd made the decision, and saying, "If you want to keep it, we can start here." He hadn't kept it. But he'd come back with his next car. I was paying attention. I drove to Calder on a Saturday in early December. I told myself it was because she'd mentioned needing advice on a clock someone had dropped off, a Vienna regulator with a broken suspension spring, nothing complicated. But she'd wanted to know if she should attempt the repair herself or call me. I told myself that was the reason. Owen, when I told him I was making the drive, said, "Uh-huh," in the tone of someone who has known you your entire life. She met me at the garage door in her work clothes. She'd been in the middle of something, and she wiped her hands on a shop rag and said, "You didn't have to come all the way. I was going to be in the area. I said. She looked at me. Were you? No, I said. That corner of her mouth. She showed me the regulator. It was on the workbench in her small office, and I looked at the suspension spring, which had snapped cleanly at the top attachment point. A simple repair, 2 hours with the right part. I told her which supplier carried replacement springs and the part number to order, and she wrote it down in the same shorthand as the clipboard in the bay. And then we stood in the office looking at the broken spring, and neither of us moved toward the door. I'll make coffee, she said. We sat in the office with coffee, and she showed me the problem car, a late-model sedan that was burning oil in a pattern she hadn't seen before, subtle enough that the owner had driven it for 2 years before bringing it in, and by then the pattern was visible in the residue on the heads. She walked me through her diagnostic thinking the way I walk her through a movement. This piece, then this piece, then this one, following the energy transfer back to the source of the fault. She was right about all of it. I told her so. She looked pleased in the private, contained way she looked pleased. A slight easing around the eyes, a half-inch lift in the shoulders. It was the same expression she'd had when I told her the clock was keeping time at 5 seconds. I was collecting those expressions without meaning to. She drove me to the good lunch place in Calder, a diner on the main street with 6 booths and a counter and a hand chalkboard menu, and we ate and talked, and outside it started to snow. Just a dusting. She looked at it through the window and said, "First of the season." Something in her voice when she said it. Not dread, exactly, more like readiness. The way someone who knows what's coming acknowledges it. "Do you like the snow?" I asked. "I don't mind it," she said. "I grew up with it. You just have to know what you're driving into and plan accordingly." She looked at me. Most people get into trouble because they're surprised by it, like they forgot it happened every year. "Things go better when you're not surprised," I said. "That's the whole job," she said. "Auto repair, clock repair, probably everything else too." She picked up her coffee cup. "Not being surprised." I said, "I'm not surprised by you." She looked at me across the table with those direct eyes and the full weight of her attention, which I had learned by then was something she did not distribute carelessly. Then she said, "Good," and went back to her coffee, and I felt the words settle in the room like something placed deliberately in its right location. I drove back to Dryden in the early afternoon. I sat in the workshop for an hour after I got home and didn't do any work. I just sat with the clock on the bench and listened to it run and thought about oil burning in a pattern subtle enough to miss for 2 years, and how the damage accumulates when you don't name the thing that's wrong. In the second week of December, she said on the phone, "I think I've been doing this thing my whole life, where I wait for a system to show me its problem rather than just asking what's wrong with it." "That's not a bad instinct for machines," I said. "It's terrible for people," she said. I said, "I know. You do it too," she said. "You listen for the sound of what's wrong instead of asking." I didn't argue. She was right. I had spent 11 years developing a skill that was very useful in a workshop and somewhat paralyzing everywhere else. The workshop required patience, required waiting for the clock to reveal its fault. People didn't work the same way. People could just be asked. "What's wrong, Nate?" she said, with a careful neutrality that told me she was asking something with dimensions. My throat closed in the way it does when I'm about to say something I haven't said out loud. "I think about you every day," I said. "I cleaned your grandmother's clock, and I thought about you for every hour of the week it took. I ate dinner at my kitchen table after you left in November, and the room was so quiet I didn't know what to do with myself, and I sat there for an hour after I'd finished eating, which is not something I've done in years." I stopped. I don't know how to say it better than that, But I don't want to keep waiting for the right moment to say it, because I've been waiting for the right moment for about a month now, and there isn't a better one coming." There was a long pause. "I drove past the highway exit for Dryden twice last week," she said. "Both times I was coming home from a parts pickup in Montpellier, and both times I got on the ramp and then got back off it because I told myself I didn't have a reason." "You have a reason now," I said. A pause. "Okay," she said. She called 2 weeks later on a Friday evening in late December at 8 o'clock. The weather had turned, the first real snow of the season, the kind that comes heavy and quiet and changes the sound of everything. I'd spent the afternoon watching it through the workshop window and thinking about whether I should call her rather than waiting for Thursday. She said, "I know this is not how you plan things." I said, "Okay." "I drove 3 hours because I needed to see you," she said. "I'm in your driveway." I stood up from the couch. Through the front window I could see headlights and the white shape of a car dusted in snow, and the exhaust making a small cloud in the cold. I went to the door and opened it. She was standing at the bottom of the porch steps in her work jacket and her gray knit hat, both of them covered in a thin layer of snow from the walk up the drive, and she was looking at me with the direct, unguarded expression of someone who has made a decision and is not second-guessing it. Her hands were in her pockets. Behind her the snow was still coming down, slow and heavy, the way it comes when it means to stay. "You drove in this," I said. "The roads are fine," she said. "I know how to drive in snow. I know you do." She looked up at me from the bottom step. "I was going to call first," she said. "I got to about 40 miles out, and I realized calling first would give me a reason to turn around if you didn't answer right. And I didn't want a reason to turn around." I said, "You didn't need one." She climbed the steps, and I moved back from the door, and she came inside. And I closed the door on the snow and the cold. She stood in my hallway and took off her hat and her jacket, and her hair was down, and her cheeks were red from the cold. From the kitchen counter her grandmother's clock, I'd offered to keep it for a while after she picked it up, to monitor the regulation, and she'd said yes, and neither of us had discussed when she'd take it back, kept its clean, steady count. I heard it the way I hear it now, which is not as background, as presence. She looked around the house with the same attention she'd given the clock the first time, taking it in without rushing it. "It's exactly what I thought it would be," she said. "Quiet," I said. "That's not a criticism," she said, and looked at me. "I've been very loud my whole life, the shop, the work, the noise of a garage. I come home at night, and my house in Calder is loud in the way empty houses are loud, appliances and road noise and the furnace. This is," she stopped. "This is a different kind of quiet." "What kind?" She thought about it. "The kind that has something in it," she said, "rather than the kind that doesn't." I looked at her in the hallway with the snow outside the window, and the clock in the kitchen, and the lamp on low, and the house that had been quiet in only one way for a long time. "I'm glad you didn't turn around," I said. "Me too," she said. "Very much." I put my hand on the side of her face, and she leaned into it. And then she put both hands against my chest and stepped forward and kissed me. It was unhurried. The kind of kiss that takes its time because there is finally time to take. Because someone drove 3 hours in the snow and parked in the driveway and came up the steps without calling first. And that act alone said everything that needed to be said. And the kiss was just the confirmation. When she pulled back, she said, "I'm staying tonight, if that's okay." The roads are fine," she said. "I want to stay." "Okay," I said. She went to the kitchen and looked at the clock ticking on the counter and touched the case lightly with one finger, the way you touch something that has come back to you. I stood in the doorway and watched her. "Still 5 seconds?" she said. 4.5 now, I said. "It's still settling." She looked at me over her shoulder with that expression, the one that isn't quite a smile until it is. "That's a good sign." "Yes," I said, "it is." She moved to Dryden in March. Not immediately. There were months between that December night and March. Months of driving and phone calls, and one Saturday in January when I drove to Calder and spent the day at the garage watching her work. And understood watching her work the way I understand watching anyone who has mastered something. The precise economy of motion. The diagnostic instinct. The way she listened before she touched. She had a mechanic named Roy who had been with her since her father's time, and who watched me for the first 2 hours with deep suspicion and then, somewhere around noon, told me a joke, which Owen later said was Roy's form of official approval. She found a garage to rent in Dryden and opened in April, smaller than Calder, starting with the regular maintenance crowd and building from there. She was diagnostic and meticulous, and her pricing was honest, which in a town that had been driving 40 minutes for anything beyond an oil change was enough to fill 3 months of appointments in 6 weeks. We live in the house on the Hill Road outside Dryden now, the one Owen helped me fix up over 2 winters, where the workshop is still mine, and she took the second bay of the attached garage for her tools. On weekend mornings we sometimes work in our respective spaces in parallel, separated by a wall, each of us doing the quiet, concentrated work of our trades. And I can hear her moving around on the other side of the wall, and she can hear the clock I'm working on, and neither of us needs to say anything. Her grandmother's clock is on the mantel in the living room. I regulate it twice a year now. It has not stopped once since I cleaned it. The tick of it is the first thing I hear in the morning and the last thing I hear at night, and it has become so steady and so present that I notice it the way you notice your own heartbeat. Not always, but when you listen for it, it's there. Owen came for dinner in the fall, and he sat at the table and looked at the 2 of us in the kitchen, and he said, "I'm glad I got that flat tire," and Iris told him he should really get his front left brake pad looked at, and Owen said, He knew, and the table was loud with people who had decided to stay. I spent a long time being very still. I thought stillness was a feature, the discipline of the work, the quiet of the house, the way a clock repair shop on a side street in a small Vermont town exists at a remove from urgency. I think now that I was confusing stillness with being stopped. The gears were there. The mainspring was wound. I just had not had the right amount of attention in a long time, and things that have not been attended to will sometimes run down without making a sound. She drove 3 hours in the snow and knocked on my door, and the clock on the counter kept its count. And I understood for the first time in years that a quiet house and a quiet life are not the same thing, and I had been living in one without the other, and that the difference between the two is exactly the size and shape of a person who listens before she touches and finishes what she starts and drives without calling first, because she doesn't want a reason to turn around.